Hey everyone, and welcome. Today I'm going to do a demonstration for you on a homemade board. A board that I prepared myself using clear gesso that was tinted with just a little bit of yellow golden liquid acrylic. And you saw my board. It's really hard to see the texture. I'm going to try to put a picture on in the comment section so that you can see the texture. But know that it's a random brush stroke. When I start to apply the pastel, you'll be able to see the texture a little bit better. Now I want to give you some tips on working on a homemade prepared surface. And by the way, this is a piece of gator board, not foam core, but gator board. All right, here's the photo that I'm working from, the small crummy photograph. It is a wheat field, and there's some distant, looks like distant trees, and it's kind of a cloudy day. But the main focus is going to be the wheat field, so I'm going to have a higher horizon. I'm going to raise the horizon. So I'm going to stick that up here. You can see that I've selected some pastels to use. Now oftentimes people say, how many pastels should I use? I often pick more than I intend to really use, and just so that I don't have to break my concentration and go to my big box. So I've got some darks for the dark areas, I've got some greens for the trees, I've got some blues and purples for the kind of cloudy sky, and I've got some yellows and oranges for the wheat field. I've got some harder pastels that I can use to create some more detailed marks, and these lighter colors are probably going to be used for the sky, for the clouds. I'm going to do my initial drawing this time with a pastel pencil. Usually I'll use a pencil, pastel pencil, or a hard pastel, whatever I happen to have handy, but I'm going to put my glasses on. A pastel pencil works great for drawing your initial design. So I've got some tree shapes here, and I want to stagger them just a little bit. And again, you know, the photograph is only giving me some general ideas of what's happening. I am going to take up my artistic license so that I can make the painting a little bit more interesting. I've got this big wheat field to deal with, and I don't want it to be this big boring shape. So you can see I've drawn a kind of rough zigzag Z shape. That's so that I can darken this area underneath the wheat field. Well, I call this the dirt, so that I can kind of subtly lead you or the viewer back into the distance. I like how there's some distant, really dark, they might be low clouds, but they could be mountain shapes. I'm going to leave it to your imagination. And then I've got some interesting low-hanging clouds right there. So that's the extent of my initial drawing. The next step is to do some sort of underpainting or block in. Now, one thing you'll find if you work on a homemade surface is that when you apply the pastel, and I don't know if you can see this on the camera, but when you apply the pastel skips over the divots created from the brush strokes of the brush when I applied that clear gesso or tinted gesso. And so there's a couple ways we can get around this. Now, a lot of times this texture can be annoying. You know, it's like, it's not covering up the whole paper. But what I want to encourage you to do is to embrace this idea of the texture, because that's the beauty. Oh, it's very loud. That's the beauty of working on a homemade surface, is that you get this feeling of texture. I would not get this much texture if I was working on just regular smooth paper. So I'm going to block in all the darks, so those are the tree shapes are the darks. And again, I'm darkening this kind of subtle pathway leading through the wheat field. I'm going to then block in the cloud shapes. And I'm going to use the sky shape. The sky is kind of dark. I'm going to also use that same blue to block in those distant trees or mountains, whatever it is you want. And then I want to block in some of the green. That looks like the same blue. You know, sometimes when your pastels are dirty, it's not always a good thing because you can't see the color. I wanted to add a little green there because when I look at my photo, I see that there's some green stuff popping up in the field. And then I'm going to block in some gold in the wheat. Now notice that I selected a yellow color for my tone of the board. I toned it yellow on purpose because I knew that I would have a lot of yellow because of the wheat field, and I wanted that yellow in the underpainting or the tone of the paper to peek through and start to kind of suggest the colors that I want in my painting. So that's just a real quick and easy way to get that illusion of the wheat by choosing the right color to put underneath. And those are the clouds. Now, when you look at this, you can still see a lot of the paper showing through, and you can see a lot of the textures showing through. Now, I might just keep painting on this and not worry about that because I want that feeling of texture, and I want the pieces of yellow to peek through. But sometimes, you know, that really does tend to be distracting, and if that's the case, then the next thing that you can do is take a piece of this pipe insulation foam. You all seen it in the videos, I'll put a picture of it, and use that pipe insulation foam to rub in this first layer. And what this does is it fills in those divots created by the texture in the board from the homemade surface. It pushes it into the surface a little bit more, so it effectively tones your paper and gets rid of a lot of the it doesn't eliminate the texture is still going to be there, but it allows you to paint on top of it without having to be distracted by all the pieces. Alright, so now the block-in is complete, and I'm going to start actually painting with the pastels. The first thing I'm going to do is block in the dark areas, and that would be the tree shape. So I'm going to go in, and I'm going to use a dark burgundy to block in these tree shapes. And I'm going to also use the same color to block in that suggested dark pathway going down to the bottom of the painting. And I'm going to use a dark purple. Now I'm not going to use this dark purple all the way in the distant trees because it's just too dark. It's actually a Terry Ludwig eggplant, and it's too dark, and it wouldn't be that dark that far in the distance. But I did put some in the foreground to help create that illusion of depth. We talked about creating depth last month, so if you're new to the page, be sure to go back to last month so that you can get the lesson on creating depth. Now I'm using a dark brown. Now these are all very close in value, so that way they kind of play together nicely. And let's see, I'm going to jump ahead and use the dark green because these trees are dark green after all. I have to consider where the light is on these trees, and I'm going to do that in just a few minutes. So now I have all the darks blocked in. The next thing that I typically like to do is do the sky, and I like to do the sky because it sets the mood, it sets the tone of the painting. So before I do the sky, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of the lighter green on the tree edges, so that way I know just how far I need to pull my sky down. So I'm using a lighter, very slightly lighter value green, and let's do it a little bit lighter yet. Whenever I'm making changes in value in a painting, I like to go in baby steps. So like I'm not going to go jump to the lightest color I have. I want to gradually increase the level of lightness, and then that way it allows you to maintain that sense of form. If you go too quickly to the light, then you lose the shape. I'm also going to use the sky to make the outer edges of these tree shapes more interesting. Right now they're a little on the boring side. So now I'm going to do the sky. One thing I really enjoyed about this scene was it looked as though it was kind of a stormy cloud day breaking up, like the storm clouds are breaking up. So I'm going to use this darker blue down here. I think it's a cloud bank. I can't be sure, but we could read it as mountains. Sometimes it's not really all that critical. You know, you just want to suggest, it's so far in the distance, you want to suggest that something is there. It's a little bit too dark. Excuse me. When I squint at it, this blue shape kind of merges into the tree shape. So that means it's probably a little too dark. Well, it is a little too dark. So I'm going to use a lighter blue-violet and just lighten it a little bit. So that way it feels like it's further back. If I left it the same darkness as the tree shape, then it would look like they were all in the same area or same plane. And I don't want that to happen. Alright, I'm going to add a little bit of that color up here where there's a cloud. And this is the fun part, because now I'm simply going into my pastels that I selected and pulling some to create an interesting sky. Now here's the fun part with working on a homemade surface. I don't know how much the camera can pick up of this, but you can see the texture or brush marks that was from the brush strokes that I applied the ground with, and it almost looks as if I've painted the pastel on with a brush. So it's kind of magical in that way. And I am not going to rub it in. I'm going to embrace these wonderful variations and this wonderful texture that is being created. And I know it's hard, especially if you feel like you want a lot of control over your paintings. It's hard to let go and say, no, I don't want that. This is the beauty of working on a homemade surface. Embrace those imperfections. Embrace the wonderful, like, happy accidents that are happening. I'm going to lighten the horizon a little bit using yellow. Now, we talked last month in our sky lessons about creating a connection between what's happening in the sky and what's happening on the ground. I know there's going to be a lot of yellow on the ground, so I definitely want to add yellow up into the sky. And finally, there's a little bit of a brightening on some of those clouds, so I'm going to use a lighter value. And again, look at how the texture is showing through. It's kind of creating this like energy in the sky that I couldn't even begin to make up if it was just smooth. So I really love working with a textured surface. Again, I forget how much fun it is. I get lazy about making up those boards, but I think if you do it all at once, then you have them to play with. That was a little too white. I'm adding a pale yellow. I didn't like that it was so white. All right. I think I need to add a couple of sky holes here. Like sky holes, I'll put a few in and I'll just tap them slightly with my finger so that they kind of don't look like I put Christmas ornaments on my tree. Now I'm going to move forward and I'm going to be painting the wheat field. I think the first thing I'm going to do is put in this nice bright, I love how it's nice and bright in the distance. And I'm actually shouting. So when we talk about mark making, this is what I consider a shouting mark, where I just make a mark with my pastel very hard. I press very hard because I'm not going to revisit it again. I'm going to leave it alone. I'm going to take those marks, put them in with this yellow, and I'm going to leave them alone. And that becomes the distant field. And then I'm going to make my way forward. I'm going to actually add a kind of dark orangey yellow color to this wheat field before I get into painting the wheat. Now this is where the texture is really going to come in handy, because the wheat field was kind of crazy. It was all over the place, right? I mean, wheat was growing this way, wheat was growing that way, blowing in the wind. And so this texture of the board is going to suggest the feeling of the wheat blowing in the wind without me having to paint individual stalks, or I don't know what the technical term is for wheat. And now that I put in the darker color, I can come with the brighter or lighter color on top. Now yellow, when we want to create depth with yellow, we want to use duller yellows in the distance, duller, and then we can use brighter pure yellows as we come forward. The reason why I used a really bright yellow in that distance is because there was sunlight hitting that distant field. And we talked about how when we create depth, can we use a bright, intense, warm color in the distance and still get away with it? Well, one thing is you would just say, okay, well, what else would be happening in that area to create depth? And one of the other things that would happen is there would be not a lot of detail. So it's just one shape, and then that allows it to feel like it's going back into the distance. So I'm using the duller colors in the distance, and as I come forward, I'm starting to use some brighter colors for more of a pure yellow. Now, this is the fun part, because you can start to see the texture. I'm changing the direction of my marks. In the distance, I don't know if you noticed, but I made my marks going in horizontal bands, like so. As I'm coming closer to us, I'm starting to change the direction of my marks to go more up and down, the way you would see the front of those wheat growing. I'm also trying to be careful to leave this foreground area dark, so that way I can pull some individual sticks of wheat, or stalks, I think that would be the official term, of wheat into this area here, and it would leave that dark mass so that I can see how you can sort of follow this subtle darkening that I created. If I didn't put that down underneath, it would be really hard to come put it on top. I'm going to continue some of this, take this color here that's in the distance and pull just a little bit of it in the foreground, just so that it's not quite as isolated as it is right in there. So I'm just going to try to make a smoother transition, if you will. I'm also going to take my finger and soften the edge right here, because I really don't want your eye to go there right away. And right now it's a hard edge and a light against the dark, so my eye's going boom. But the minute I softened it with my finger, you can go there, but you're not pulled there like a magnet. So that's one thing I want to do. All right, I'm coming up to the finish. I'm going to add some of the green. My goal is to get your eye to move back into the distance. So the marks that I'm making now are to create areas of contrast that are going to lead your eye back into the distance and behind those trees. I think I can add another sky hole area just to break that shape up a little bit. I think I can do with a few indications of some trunks in these tree masses, just to make it a little more interesting, like so. And I think they can get a little bit more light on them, so I'm going to use a little bit of a lighter value green in the trees. And I'm not painting leaves because it's too far in the distance, you wouldn't see leaves. I'm just making marks, and I'm letting the texture of the paper, of that wonderful homemade support, help suggest the feeling of the foliage. Now let's come and pull some more of that wheat down here. And I see one thing that is really exciting to me, and there's some lightening of that wheat, like the sunlight is kind of hitting on some of the stalks. So I'm using a lighter value yellow, and I'm putting big strokes of that lighter value, kind of just marching it down into the field. If I put it all over the place, it would no longer be as effective. So I've got to put a little bit in, and then I've got to stop. And then I'm going to take the edge of this lighter value pastel, and I'm making some linear marks, some very light broken lines to suggest some of the stalks of wheat. And the one thing you can remember is if you suggest something, the viewer's eye will fill in the rest. So I'm going to put some of those heads of the wheat on the top of the stalks. I'm going to only suggest a few of them, with the idea being that I suggest a few and your eye or the viewer's eye will be able to fill in the rest. I'm using a darker yellow just to mix in. Suggest a few and let the viewer fill in the rest. And the texture of the board is really helping me give an even stronger suggestion of the texture and the rich texture of this wheat field. So I am at a stopping point right now, but I think you get the idea that embrace the texture of your homemade surface, let it work for you, and it will really help enhance your paintings and help create a more expressive painterly painting. And so I hope this has been helpful, and if you have questions, ask them in the comments.